games. My name is Bo Jansen. I'm the education lead for the VFX program here at Gnomon, and it's with great honor I'll introduce and host our panel of guests for tonight. But before I introduce them, I want to say a couple things. First, I want to thank Lenovo, as always, for sponsoring this event. Lenovo helps us to bring these free educational events out to you. The live stream is going to be added to our stream catalog, and it's going to be available to watch on our Twitch and YouTube channels after the event concludes. And our events, including this stream, are also available with closed captions via the Gnomon Facebook page. And you can find a link to our Facebook page down there in the chat for this. And with that said, let me introduce now our guest for the evening. We have Kevin Huynh, who's a principal VFX artist. Kevin Huynh is a veteran VFX artist and principal artist at Beyond Effects with nearly a decade of experience in the AAA video game industry. Kicking off his career at Ubisoft Montreal, Kevin worked his way up from an intern to become a key member of the VFX department at the Far Cry franchise. At Sony Santa Monica studio, Kevin brought his brand of technically refined and elegantly rendered visual effects to the latest God of War title, where he earned a VES nomination for Best VFX in a Real-Time Project. Driven by his need to craft amazing VFX while solving challenging problems, Kevin continues to develop his strong technical knowledge at Beyond Effects, implementing solutions to complex problems he encounters on projects. If it's a challenge, he can solve it. Kevin also enjoys tinkering with cars, all things racing, and embracing his foodie side with a similar mentality. If it's a challenge, he'll eat it. Also want to welcome Thomas Atchley, a senior VFX artist. Thomas Atchley is a talented and driven senior VFX artist at Beyond Effects, who has traveled across the games industry, making his mark on titles including the VES-nominated Game of the Year recipient, God of War, Call of Duty Black Ops 4, Halo Infinite, and Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. Engrossed with the possibility of becoming a VFX artist since the 5th grade, young Thomas eventually saved up his money to buy a copy of After Effects after realizing he could craft effects just like the ones he on the OG YouTube videos. Technically oriented, Thomas keeps his finger on the pulse of experiment in the VFX community and continues to hone his reputation as a reliable and proficient effects artist, and first earned during his time at the Gnomon School of Effects. Ever the forward thinker, Thomas spends much of his free time experimenting in Unreal and cultivating any unique hobby he can sink his teeth into. Table tennis, miniature painting, and we also want to welcome Nathan Huang, senior VFX artist. Nathan Huang is a senior VFX artist at Beyond Effects, whose passion for stylized and flashy effects grew from his consumption of decades of watching animation. After relocating from New Zealand and finishing his studies at Gnomon School of Visual Effects, Nathan dove into crafting lore-rich visual effects for multiple VR projects. You can also spot his work in games spanning multiple platforms, including the award-winning Legends of Runeterra, where many of his elements continually delight players. Nathan continuously funnels passion for VFX into pushing the bar with his art and has begun to make a name for himself as the Kiwi who will not only find a way to make VFX pop, but will make sure it pops with colossal impact and look good doing it. When Nathan isn't neck deep in his passion for real-time effects, he spends his time outdoors playing volleyball or taking in nature on hikes. He also likes to one-up himself with every spice until it's unbearable and bored. So we have a theme of some masochistic food here. So welcome, guys. Welcome to the stream.
Hi.
So
hey.
We got all of us here.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Nathan's here too.
Thanks for the intro as well.
Hello, Nathan.
Yeah.
So wanted just to start off here, the idea of real-time visual effect.
I guess I can start. I guess real-time visual effects are all the effects you see in real-time applications, such as games, AR, VR, interactive installations, that all have the need to be interactive mediums. And it's all effects like fire, magic, explosions, sparks, anything that doesn't fall into the realms of like modeling, animation, lightning, and all those like disciplines that we know very well. Everything that's a bit special and unique goes to visual effects. Do you guys have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think the key thing to note as well for effects artists out there who are in the films industry or who are currently at Gnomon going through the effects course, simulation is part of our package, but our main focus is always interaction. It's effects that can be viewed from multiple angles or utilized in hundreds of different scenarios, rather than just whatever is made for the frame itself.
Yep, and the keyword is real time. So yeah, it just needs to make sure it's playing on whatever system it's on.
All right, cool. I think we've got an example of some of the work that you've done. If you want to switch over in that, Miranda, if you want to cue that up for us, we can see some of the work. All right, so that was all from one of the mobile games you worked on. I think we also have another reel of other kinds of work that just is kind of one type of work that you do. And do we have another one, Miranda, to queue up here? We can check out their other sizzle reel. Just again to show kind of the breadth of work that you all are producing. Do we have that up, Miranda? There we go. Cool. That's definitely some very beautiful work. You should be very, very proud of how that all that looks. And it's such a vast variety of work. You've got the mobile game, you've got these other AAA games. I'm curious about this. What would maybe be some VFX that we might not expect would be the kind of work you would do? We assume that if you've got someone with a giant magical sword, that may fall under your kind of work. But what are some other kind of maybe more hidden effects or things you might not expect would be the kind of work you would do?
Yeah, like you mentioned, right? Like the obvious ones, like magic, gunshots, muzzle impacts, explosions. Like those are like the obvious ones. But there's also like some really more subtle effects that people might not realize that fall under this category, but still have like a really strong impact on the game. Stuff like small environmental effects like ambient fog, dust motes in the air, like just small stuff that lives in the environment, like drips adds a lot of life to environments as well. And also stuff that doesn't fall into, like we mentioned earlier, into other categories of like disciplines. So stuff like full screen effects, and also sometimes some weird like shader stuff. It's a really broad role to be in games, because you get to touch a lot of things.
We don't just work with particle systems. A lot of our work has to do with shaders and anything having to do with interaction a lot of the time. So usually if the player's interacting with something or things are interacting together in the game, we have some sort of touch in it. So
Yeah, I would like to add like stuff like UI, UX kind of stuff, so points and clicks, even like motion graphics in the background, stuff like that.
Yeah, it also varies like from studio to studio and production to production, because I think the role of like the real-time VFX artist depends on the strengths of the artists themselves, and the studio kind of adapts themselves to make sure that they work their best in the environment.
Oh, very cool. So you've already kind of, I think, begin to define the real-time work in games as opposed to film. In general, I mean, this is, I think, part of the general discussion this evening to sort of define this discipline, but how would you begin to define the kind of work for visual effects or simulation for films as opposed to working in games?
So actually, there's a lot of similarity and a lot of intercrossing there, especially depending on which backgrounds you come from. So for instance, I went through the course at Gnomon, but I took the VFX course, where our main focus is simulation and Houdini and all that jazz, right? The film pipeline. But through my latter half at Gnomon, I wanted to work in games. Like I always wanted to work in games, but I needed to learn how to liaison it. And I found out pretty quickly that there are a lot of different pools of skill sets in the games industry, and especially in real-time VFX, where if you have a simulation background in film, you're still able to come with that unique perspective into the space. There are a lot of people in our industry who can simulate, but there are a lot of people who can't. They come from different positions of stylized effects or hand-drawn or traditional animation, any and all of the above. So effects or real-time VFX in general has a broad perspective when it comes to connections between real-time and offline renders.
Yeah, I think the main difference between like offline or like film VFX and real-time VFX is just the nature of it, right? Like real-time VFX requires it to be rendered really quickly, and we're talking about like milliseconds, right? Typically on a game, like the effects budget is like 2 or 3 milliseconds at most, compared to films where you can take hours, days, or even weeks trying to render out and simulate a shot. Games, we have to deliver that in 3 milliseconds. So we have to try our best to use the different techniques and approximations, where simulation can have like the really precise calculations on how something will move through space and interact with the ground. In games, we basically have to find ways to calculate everything from simulation, rendering, and lighting and all that stuff in a really, really short amount of time. So in a way, it's like less precise, but we're striving to reach the same quality as film VFX or pre-rendered VFX.
It's slowly merging, like between the film side and the game side, as you know, hardware increases. But yeah, what we said before is like we usually would do like a simulation, which would then convert to like a flipbook, which can then be applied to real-time effects. And there's other tools like distractions just need to be baked.
Yeah, there's actually like a lot of crossover, like you mentioned, Nathan, like techniques from offline sims that we're trying to incorporate into real-time workflows to try and get that fidelity up while still working within the constraints of the real-time engines.
Yeah, cool. So one thing we follow up, Thomas, you made a comment that not all of the effects artists necessarily have a dynamics background. What other skills would they therefore have? I mean, what other supporting skills are they bringing to the table if it's not dynamic simulation?
A lot of our work has to do with traditional 2D animation concepts, or just dealing with particle systems and shaders. So a lot of technicality comes in from how deep of an understanding you have of how shaders work, or how you can utilize them in ways that are interesting or visually appealing, and also how well you understand traditional animation concepts. So a lot of that stuff relates to the stylized world. A lot of the simulation side relates specifically to the realism side of games. So
Yeah, there's also a lot of work, because like the simulation part is for stuff that's basically pre-engine, right? It's everything that doesn't end up one-to-one in the game. It's finding how to get that offline data into the game efficiently, and in the way that will benefit the game the most, or the real-time product the most.
absolutely.
It's kind of like that critical, like, technical skill that you need to figure out like how to best use this data that you have offline, and how to feed it to the engine so that you get the most out of it, in the way that will work for the engine also. And I think like there's a lot of things you can do achieve without simulations. Personally, like, offline simulations aren't my strong suit, and I'm like pretty weak, if all things considered, in it. But there are still a lot of things that you can do, just with shader tricks, composing with particle systems in the engine. And also I've had the luck of working with a lot of like really skilled simulation artists who are well versed in simulations, so they can cover for my weaknesses also.
I think. Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
I think we have a lot of connection with tech art as well. I've known people who their main focus was technical environment art, and they transitioned into VFX seamlessly and have become an absolutely incredible effects artist. So,
Do you want to define tech art for artists? Make sure that people know that term.
yeah, sure. I think it's kind of a bit generalized, but the way I view tech art is anything and everything having to do with interaction with the engine itself. It's usually, if you're in Unreal, it's blueprints related, or HLSL related, or deep shaders, any and everything having to do with the more complex side that's not straight out of the box with whatever engine you're working with.
They make sure our stuff works.
Yeah.
Yeah, also performance and just like workflow things are also things that technical artists would typically look at.
Okay, cool. So maybe we'll explain a little bit the importance of the VFX in the games. So how do you see your effects as this as a factor that improves gameplay?
I think VFX, like, they're kind of invisible, right? Like you rarely hear them talked about in reviews. You hear about character animation, lighting, performance, all that stuff, right? The VFX are kind of like this thing in the background that nobody knows really exists, but if it's not there, people would notice, right? Like for all this stuff, I think for me, the most important reason is for like feedback in the game, right? Like if you consider a first-person shooter, if you didn't have the bullet impacts and the muzzle flashes when you're shooting, the guns would feel weak, and like you wouldn't feel anything when you're shooting. There would be sound, but without the bullet impact to see the reaction of your action, it would feel really hollow. Stuff like that, like impacts in fighting games, and also just bring spectacle to the game. Like for example, in Runeterra, like if there were no effects in Runeterra, like I don't think the game would look as good as it does, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't know, you can probably speak to it more, Nathan, but
Yeah, I would say it's like players' expectation. Like if you play something that's, like for instance, a giant bazooka, and it's just like a weak puff, it just doesn't have the same kind of impact, like compared to like a pistol muzzle flash. Yeah, I would say it's just like players' expectation. Like,
I think in general, effects are kind of binary when it comes to gameplay related things, where it's either the absolute main focus of the action that a player is doing or interacting with, or even a cinematic moment, or they are invisible, like Kevin said, where if they weren't there, you would absolutely notice, but when they are there, it's just a seamless experience that makes it all the better.
Yeah, in talking about like invisible effects, like as a tip to environment artists doing their like portfolio pieces, like just adding dust motes and just really thin mist in the background really helps add atmosphere and life to their environments. And it's like a really cheap thing, but it can add some life and just like this extra little touch that makes the environment look that much better. And I think also FX has a really important purpose for gameplay. Like you want to know when you're in somewhere that might hurt you. Like for example, in a game like Diablo, you want to know where are the damages going to be applied to you. If it's like area of effect where you can't walk after the spell has been cast, all that stuff.
Oh, cool. I mean, so it's a basic beyond the spectacle, kind of this intrinsic part of knowing how the game's working and what you can do and can't do.
Yeah, it's actually like a really strong like language, or like we're part of the language that speaks to the player in the game and make sure that the intents of the designers are expressed correctly to the player.
Yeah, speaking of like talking with designers, it's like a huge kind of like team communication between designers and art, just to make sure that what the designers want is, we don't want something too powerful, which the designers did not want to be too powerful. Yeah.
Very cool. So what about the ways that your field of work of working real-time VFX, how do you see that changing at the moment as technologies change, as games develop? How are you seeing your industry, evolve right now?
I think the thing that looking to the future I'm most excited about personally, I'm not sure about Kevin and Nathan here, but the thing that I've been watching closely over the last few years has been a shift away, hopefully, in focus from particle systems to real-time fluid systems. They're not integrated, and they're not things that are really accessible at all right now. But there are a few groups of people who are testing sort of basic versions of them. And when those evolve, we won't really see a difference between the film VFX pipeline and the real-time VFX pipeline, which would just be absolutely incredible and would open up a lot of doors and make real-time VFX in general just all the better for it.
Yeah, like we're not quite there yet, like you said, and we like there are like softwares like EmberGen who are like getting closer and closer to like having real-time fluid simulations in game. I even think like Epic is getting really, really close with like their implementations in Fortnite on PS5. They like dropped like a couple hints on that. There's like some really, really interesting stuff going on in that space, and it's like really exciting to be in this space right now because like we're like really close or on the cusp of like having a big paradigm shift on how real-time VFX operate in games or just in real time as a whole. And I think as a whole, like the industry or like the gap between pre-rendered and real time is like slowly shrinking. Like we're seeing Unreal becoming more and more of a big player in film pipelines, like the virtual production stuff, or even like the latest demo that Weta and Unreal have put out for the Meerkat demo. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's pretty impressive. Pretty impressive, like what can be rendered like at the 30 frames per second on a home computer at that visual fidelity.
Yeah, there's like stuff like EmberGen where you can like do fluid simulations in real time, which is what we kind of want to head towards. Yeah.
I think right now there's I'm sorry.
No.
I think there's an interesting trajectory right now for real time in general outside of the VFX space, and I expect that the VFX space will coincide with that trajectory as we move forward. So like for instance, the Mandalorian and the VAD pipeline that Disney's attempting to use right now. Eventually, because right now they're working with singular frames outputs onto like LED screens or LED panels or however it's said. And if in the future that becomes something that can be rendered at frame rate, then that's something that the effects world will also be a part of, which would create a very strange but interesting gap between the real-time FX techniques that we use right now and the film effects techniques that the film and television industry use.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I mean, it's always exciting to see, you know, a SIGGRAPH paper or something that shows, you know, what you can do if you're off in, you know, a lab somewhere, but then to bring that to actually into the hands of the artists and see what you can then accomplish with it when it's a viable tool for the pipeline.
I think even if real-time workflows aren't like as precise as offline tools, I think the fact that it's interactive and the feedback is immediate, the iterations that you're able to get out of it might make up for the quality that you might not have, like just in raw technical calculation.
Yeah. And that's the thing also, just to speak from the standpoint of working in a film pipeline, it's all a big cheat. It's not like we're being physically accurate in the film pipeline. It's always a cheat. It's just how far can you push the cheat?
I mean, we do the same thing as well. We cheat some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Like we have to hack away.
I've had that kind of misconception. People who work in games think, well, you all do it for real, and it's all like physically accurate, and you spend forever. It's like if there's anything we can do as a flat cutout, we'll still do it in film. It doesn't mean that we have to. Everything has to be fully on 3D dimensional.
I think that's just the nature of VFX, right? It's like, how can we cheat reality?
Yeah. We're all just, you know, magicians, and whatever makes the illusion gets the job done.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. So in terms of other mediums that you bring your effects to, I think you kind of touched on this. Other than for video games, I'll talk to other things that you apply your effects to working in real time.
I think AR and VR are like probably the second one that would come to mind. Virtual production, like VFX, aren't like really a thing for virtual production yet. But they do make use of real-time technology. ArchViz is also in that same space. What else do we have?
I know a few do like previs using real time. Yeah, I know what Tom touched on with the Mandalorian, with the background.
Yeah, I would say right now the VFX space isn't quite touching that that sort of VAD production space as well, but I think in the future we will be for sure.
Yeah, there's also like interactive installations that also might make use of real-time VFX, live shows.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like the Fortnite one. There was like a Fortnite music live.
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah. I was thinking more of like just like light installations that are like projections on real life buildings. I think those types of productions also use real time.
Those are real time. Those aren't pre-rendered.
I think there's a mix of both. There's a mix of both. Yeah.
I believe in the earlier days of Beyond Effects, we even worked on. I was not there at this time, but there was I think it was for Childish Gambino that we did some projection related stuff for. But our later guests would have more to talk about.
Yes, we're going to bring on Keith later on. He's going to talk more to kind of the business side of things here for us. Very cool. So how about this? The sort of average day in the life of a real-time effects artist. What does that look like? The kind of work that you do, the different kinds of tasks you do, different kind of hats you wear. You want to speak to that at all?
Please.
I think in general, we work with particle systems a lot. That's generally the way we interact and the way we create effects in the real-time space. It's actually pretty rare to simulate for the particle systems because that's usually done ahead of time prior to you, the real-time VFX artist, actually working with the said simulations that have been chucked out. So a lot of our work has to do with going in-game or in-engine and then testing at real-time our particle systems and just editing them and making them pop, making them beautiful. You know, that's pretty much it, I guess. But
yeah, like simulation like doesn't that come up that often. There are like periods where you will want to simulate a lot. The reason why we can't simulate for everything is just like memory constraints and and also just technical limitations. If we were to simulate a new smoke texture, for example, for all our smoke effects, our memory budget would just be busted like really quickly. So just out of necessity, we usually have a bank of textures or simulations that we pull from and reuse as much as possible, just to save memory as much as possible. But like Tom said, like most of our work will be done in engine. Not much, because all of our tools are usually integrated into the engine. We don't really use Maya that often, or 3ds Max. And like I would say for me, like 80% of the time is like doing particle systems, and then maybe 20% is like doing shader work and figuring stuff out. And the last 10% is maybe interacting with other departments, figuring out how to integrate it, troubleshooting, scheduling, stuff like that.
Yeah, on Legends of Runeterra, I mostly work on kind of like very stylized effects. So I spend a lot of time on Photoshop itself, which is just painting textures. Painting textures, and then pretty much that is moved on to the engine itself, which what the others has said, just making particle systems. Yeah, most of the time it's just quads and particle systems.
Yeah, I feel like compared to other disciplines in games, like aside from designers, we're like the artists that spend the most of our time in the engine, because like modelers probably are in Maya or ZBrush, animators in Motion Builder. Yeah,
I think lighters are pretty much the only other people who
lighters,
with this. But yeah, I think there's also an important distinction to make when it comes to particle systems, as we're talking about. Pretty much 100% of the time, the particle systems we're referring to are integrated into whatever engine we're working with at the time. So we're not talking about like thinking particles or Maya's particles or pops in Houdini or anything like that, because we pretty much don't have access to that because it is baked information. It's very, very, very rare to be able to get that data out in a way that's actually usable for us.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also like not feasible because in the case of like a bullet impact, how would you know where to simulate if you're coming from a offline package and you're bringing it into the game?
So even like cache formats aren't necessarily that transferable in the first place.
I think it's applicable for like one-off shots or like really art-directed shots, but for general gameplay, because it's so random and the player can do whatever they want, it's really hard to make caches like that work really well.
Yeah, that's always the challenge talking about art-directed and working with effects is you're working with these sort of simulation tools and particles, but then they have to be very art directed. So do you run in, how do you deal with that challenge of art directing something that's being generated with a real-time particle simulation? How do you handle that kind of level of control over your stuff?
In general, the way we approach particle systems and the way any real-time VFX artists approach particle systems is pretty universalized and oftentimes very art directable. We parameterize like everything from color to shape to movement, so that if at the drop of a hat someone says, hey, I want this to be green and it needs to be horizontal rather than vertical or whatever, right? I mean, that's like a stupidly simple request, but we can do that within minutes, realistically. All of the simulation we check out is usually very, very universalized in one way or another, or it's specifically made for a certain sequence that is considered extremely important and worth the budget of exporting out a simulation specifically for that sequence.
Yeah, like in the case of an explosion, for example, like you'll have your core fireball of like explosion, right? And then you have like a couple of ones supporting it, and then you'll layer in more smoke in the background for like dust that gets kicked up, or like just to transition the fireball into just like this dark smoke. And you might have those tendrils coming out, and we basically render all of those out as separate assets, and we slowly layer them back on together in the engine. And that's how we kind of art direct and build our explosion. Like if we want more tendrils on the left side because that's how the environment would react there. We can decide to put 2 more on the left side or 2 more on the right side. But most of the time, like if it's a generic explosion that's happening in systemic gameplay, personally, I relish the fact that it's a bit random and a bit chaotic, because no 2 explosion will look the same. And if 3 players throw grenades on your screen at the same time, they'll all have slight variations and they will all look slightly different. And that, I think, gives it more richness compared to always having the same one over and over again. So that chaotic nature of randomness, I think, plays to our favor some of the times.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Speaking of just like working with art directors, I always like to just block things out. Just try to put in whatever, like a previous effect, and just like kind of bash it to a different effect, just to get their first eyes on it, and that always kind of like speeds things up.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Because of the nature of real time, it's really quick to get iterations in and out. So it's easy for us to do quick pivots and get feedback on the stuff that we do. And like it's easy to toss it away and like start again because iteration is much quicker. You don't feel as married to the idea or the asset that you've created up until now. Although there are times where you're like, oh shit, like yeah.
Of course, that's the nature of working with it.
Yeah, I always say it's like 20% doing the base of it, and there's just 80% polish.
Yeah.
It's pretty accurate.
That last 5% to make it look beautiful is always the slowest part of the process, I would imagine.
But
Exactly.
when it hits right, though.
Yes. Let me ask each of you, what drew you into working in real-time visual effects? What drew you to this industry?
Well, I actually didn't want to be a real-time VFX artist.
You didn't?
Well, we're giving you that look, Tom.
This is the first time I'm hearing it.
Oh, really? Yeah, so actually I wanted to be a modeler or like concept artist coming out of school. But I had a chance to get into the industry as an intern. And I basically just started as an intern VFX on the Far Cry team at Ubisoft Montreal. And after like working 2 projects with them, I found out that I really liked what real-time VFX had to offer. And it was like challenges that really meshed well with me. Like I enjoyed the problems to solve, the type of work, and like being able to basically touch a bit of animation, modeling, and lighting, and like you're basically at the intersection like of a lot of interesting things, and you can combine all of those things to make an interesting shot or an interesting moment in the game. So I decided to keep following that, and I don't think I regret it. I think I'm happy to have stuck with visual effects.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, for myself, I was kind of the same. Like before I joined Norman, I wanted to do more concept art, more matte painting, and then I was introduced to visual effects through Norman, and I actually thought I was going to do more film VFX, but I really like the fast-paced nature of real-time effects. So like halfway through my course, I decided like kind of pivot or lean more towards real-time effects. And yeah, just because you get to make cool as explosions.
Yeah, and I think like that 2D experience that you have like really translates well into like those 2D effects and the work you do on Runeterra.
Yeah. All kind of disciplines kind of like mesh. Like if you have like a modeling background, you can make good, rock debris. Yeah.
I'm a bit of a freak here in terms of most people you'll talk to at the real-time VFX community, but I was actually interested in compositing and just like making cool-looking stuff. I started when I was a lot younger and was in After Effects a lot, but I knew I wanted to work in games, and I didn't know how to translate that idea from making cool explosions and I don't know, interesting things on screen from the compositing perspective to the game perspective. And then I found out when I was like 16 or 17 that the real-time VFX field existed. So then I went to Gnomon when I turned 18, like almost on the day, and then yeah, I took the VFX program and then just kept pushing.
I feel like a lot of people in the industry aren't actually real-time VFX. Like nobody really wanted to be a real-time VFX in the beginning, and they slowly like moved towards it and like grew into it. But I think like more and more like it's becoming more popular, and there's starting to have like more education around it. And I think like Tom, you might like be like one of the first generations of like people who might want to be VFX artists like from the get-go and go down that path. Like I didn't know that was a thing when I came out of school.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think with VFX, you're doing, I think just in general, all these variety of things where you're working with fire and water and smoke and debris and physical things. So it kind of draws upon a broad range of things. Maybe the simulation is a core to it, but that's one of the things which maybe you want to speak a little bit to the breadth of knowledge that you have to bring to this, that it's not just, I have this small tool set that I'm good at, but how you have to have kind of a very broad vocabulary of skills to pull these things off.
Yeah, that's definitely like a challenging part of like wearing the VFX artist hat, because the responsibilities can be so wide, and like the number of things that you might have to do are so varied. It can be really daunting. But in my experience in the productions I've worked in, everybody slightly is like an expert at something, right? And we basically find a way to make the teams work and play off of each other's strengths to try and build the tools around the knowledge that the VFX team has internally to try and play it best to our abilities. Because like not everybody will have the simulation knowledge, right? So how can we make our tools work more for like shader artists who are more well-versed in shaders, or vice versa, right? If you have a set of artists who are really good in simulations and can get like really nice flipbooks, how can we make those tools or workflows fit these people better? Ideally, all VFX artists are like experts at everything, but in reality, it's like, I don't think it's feasible.
Yeah, I think in general, the skill floor for entry into VFX is actually fairly low because of the broad spectrum that most people can have going into it. There's one little key factor that is impossible to quantify, which, I mean, Kevin, we've talked about this in the past, but having an eye for something and understanding what you think looks good versus what doesn't look good, and really constantly always trying to hit that bar and push what you think looks good versus what you don't think looks good from a lot of reference and a lot of just consumption of real-time VFX in general. So I personally believe that the technical portion of real-time VFX in terms of entry is quite low. Pretty much anyone, I think, with a few weeks of real training from someone who knows what they're talking about can get the absolute bare bones basics and be able to make something that really looks great if their eye is developed enough.
Yeah, I think that's like fair to say, especially with like YouTube, and like there's a lot more education content out there to get started in Unreal, in Cascade or Niagara, or even Unity. And I think it's not, the bar to enter isn't as, well, the curve to enter isn't as steep as it probably used to be. And I think there's a lot of references to get started.
Oh, that's very cool. And like you say, the eye training of knowing, what do these phenomena look like when you're working on them. Now, you've talked a little bit about how you got into this. I don't know how much you can speak to specific projects. Would you want to talk a bit about your work on God of War by any chance? And I know that there's a lot of proprietary things, and we don't want to get too deep into the weeds technically, but in general, taking on a project of that scope, how was it to dive into God of War?
I don't know where to start here. Well, God of War for me was like a really big milestone, I think, because I had only worked with the Dunia engine, which is the engine on Far Cry. And it was basically my first time working with a tool set of particles that wasn't the one that was on Far Cry. So it was like a really, really big leap for me, and I was really unsure that I would be able to like keep up with the tools and like the expectations, right? Because you're coming into a Sony studio, you're intimidated by the like, you know, the name Sony, right? Like you're working for Sony, and it's like really you want to make sure that you respect the franchise and you deliver the quality that people expect of it. But I think the people there were like really great and showed me the ropes, and like helped me deliver on the work. And yeah, it was a really interesting project, and I'm really glad that I got to work on it because the result in the end was really interesting. There were some really cool technical stuff that we were able to do and develop there, working with all the team there. Yeah, it was a really good experience.
Kevin is very humble about this, but his fingers were pretty much in every pie across. Yeah, he made some absolutely killer pieces of art for that. So.
Thanks, Tom.
Even if you think, oh yeah, I ramped up, yada yada, you know.
Thanks, Tom. But yeah, like it was a good production. I don't know if there's more details that you wanted to dive into for VFX specifically, but I'm not sure how deep we're allowed to go.
Yeah, I understand. I don't want to push you into revealing trade secrets, obviously, or anything. Well, again, if you can talk maybe more sort of conceptually, because again, not getting into too deep in the weeds of what buttons did you push. Then you have work on Call of Duty, Black Ops, Cold War. In terms of obviously different game, different demands, but also technology changing. With that, how is that maybe different in contrast to God of War?
Call of Duty is a game series that in general is very oriented towards having things that are reusable or systemic across the entire game. So interacting a lot with their specific engine and making things for them a lot of the times revolved around creating something that can be used in 100 scenarios. Whereas working on God of War, a lot of the stuff we did was just one-offs. It's like you make this and it only is in this scene pretty much forever. Like a lot of cinematic moments, a lot of just making effects specifically for this shot or specifically for this one enemy that only shows up once in the entire game, yada yada. Whereas working on the Call of Duty franchise, it was always you're making something for a suite of things rather than making it for just this moment. We did put our fingers into some cinematic moments for Cold War, and yeah, those are fun too. Like you always have those cool one-off moments where there's some big bombastic thing happening, and we just have to try to make it look as good as possible. So.
Yeah, I think one thing I want to mention, like after hearing Tom talk about the transition between God of War and Call of Duty, is that a lot of the studios have that aren't using Unreal have proprietary tools for particle effects. So as a VFX artist, like a lot of the challenge when you're moving from production to production is getting up to speed with the tool set for particle specifically, because you might be used to something or some workflow or some features that you might have had at your previous studio. At the next studio, it'll be something completely different. So you really have to be ready and truly understand how particle systems work, what you're looking for and what you need to make an effect look good. And while the tools might be different, you still have to deliver quality no matter where you are, right?
I think if there's one takeaway from all of this, everything we talk about, it's that having a firm understanding of concept when it comes to real-time VFX, of how things are made and what looks good and why it looks good, and all those concepts relating to your personal eye, is the main importance of being a real-time VFX artist, in my opinion. Because as Kevin said, we shift from engine to engine at VFX, especially constantly. Every project we move from that's a month, 2 months, 6 months, will be just a completely new set of tools. And that means that we have to ramp up again. We have to learn the new set of tools, and we have to apply our knowledge as artists rather than as button pushers, I guess, more than anything else.
Oh, it's fabulous. I'm feeling very validated now with my lessons when I talk to students, and show them particles and say, okay, you're learning particles in this one framework, but know that these exist all over the place. And part of being an artist, whether it's with particles or anything, is learning how to adapt to a whole different set of buttons, different semantics for working with your tools, whether you're changing to a new render or changing what moves the particles around. So thank you for this. I'm going to make sure that this stream, if I have students who are not watching this, is required viewing, because you're validating things that I say every week in my classes. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think especially for VFX, right? Just because if you truly understand like how the tech works or what fundamentally makes things click together, you might be able to take those individual pieces and rearrange them in more interesting ways and come up with new interesting behaviors. And that's how you can like have stuff that doesn't look cookie cutter and slightly more interesting.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Very cool. So how about this? Talking about the different challenges you faced, in accomplishing this. I mean, you have the framework, for instance, in God of War, where you're working more one-offs, but then Call of Duty, where it's more kind of, throughout the course of the whole game. Is that a bigger challenge to set up something that's going to work throughout the game in a whole variety of circumstances that has to, adapt to so much? Do you find those more challenging, or trying to make a one-off that's maybe more specifically art directed? Is one more of a challenge than another?
I think the challenges lie a bit in different areas. Like for the one-off like art directed piece, like the expectation is that it has to look really clean, really perfect. People are going to be scrutinizing it. The art director is going to be all over it and then like analyzing every single detail, right? Whereas the other one, where it's a more systemic game, I think they're by nature, games that require those types of effects are highly focused on gameplay and the experience that you get out of it. You have to make sure that they're really optimized and factor in the possibility of the player doing anything, right? Like, for example, in a first-person shooter, there's a chance that 8 players throw grenades in the exact same spot, and the game must not crash and still run. It's different types of problematics that you have to work around. So I don't think that one of them is like more difficult than the other. It's just completely different spaces.
I would say it's almost like left brain, right brain type of thing, where the systemic pipeline is often orientated towards making sure things either run correctly or work across all systems involved with the thing you're making. Whereas the one-off perspective is really just about what is the final frame like, and how far can we push it to that limit before we break things. So yeah.
I think one of the really interesting challenges that Nathan can probably talk better to is like optimizing for a broad range of target platforms on Runeterra, right? Because like you have to answer to mobile all the way to PC.
Yeah,
right?
that's correct. So yeah, we're working on PC and on mobile. So we have to work on like high quality assets and like trying to down res it or completely replace it. So sometimes we might need to, instead of a particle system, we might just need to put one quad there instead. It's for us, it's a lot of like just problem solving, just finding out what works in our areas, what doesn't, just like kind of test and trial.
Are there ever times where you're like, let's just do something for low spec and then just do something for high spec, or you're always trying to?
Yeah, sometimes we just need to replace the whole asset itself. Like instead of like multi-plane kind of like effects together, we might just like push it all into just one plane itself. Yeah.
And one thing also, I can appreciate the challenge of doing something like in Runeterra, where you can tell that you're basing this off of electrical effect or a liquid effect or a fire effect, but you know that you're with an more photoreal target explosion, you know you're done when it looks like a real explosion, but this is now a little more abstracted, more magical. And so how do you deal with the design element, the design factor of trying to hit effects that aren't hitting towards a photoreal target?
Yep. Hopefully, yeah. Thankfully, that Runeterra has a game based on it. Like it has League of Legends, so we use pretty much whatever references we have. The game itself, cinematics. Yeah, a lot of times it's just like looking at different kind of references and just kind of mashing it together to see what kind of fits.
I think.
I'll go for it. Go for it.
I was just gonna say, I think in general, understanding real world concepts that pertain to realistic simulation or attempting to go for a realistic look also heavily applies to the stylized world. It just means that you know where to break the rules, or you know where to bend them to make it look more or less stylized / diverge completely from how the real world works. So
yeah, most of the time it's like the physics are still realistic, but like the shapes, the colors, that's where you can go like quite stylistic and bizarre.
Yeah. Like there's still some coherence to the effects that you make, even if it's in a stylized word. And I think there's also pulling a lot from like principles of animation, right? Like there's always like moment of tension and build up, and then there's that like that main action, and then there's always like the resolution at the end where everything falls through and just like dissipates nicely. So we also like pull from that, and like when it feels good, like that's kind of when you can start feeling that, oh, we're getting close to like what the effect should be.
And that's where your eye comes in, like I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
It really comes down to your breadth of knowledge of consuming other people's art and making art yourself, and exploring and failing and making great stuff, making terrible stuff. Right?
Yeah. Like I think that eye really applies for like timing, because like even if you have like the sickest realistic simulation, if it doesn't sit well, or like it doesn't feel like snappy and just feels like a really weak poof in the game, all that simulation work goes to waste.
Yeah, I would actually say like what you mentioned, the 12 principles of animation is a huge asset for us in terms of real-time effects. Like what Kevin mentioned, just like timing, how things could like fade in, fade out. What else? Squash and stretch.
Good call.
I'm just kind of remember those top principles right now.
Yeah. Oh, very cool. Yeah. Again, thank you for reiterating topics I bring up in my class. I appreciate this. That you are animators, but you're not animating animals and creatures, people running around, but you're animating the natural world or the magical world. And so,
yeah, on the topic of animation, like I've heard somebody say something really interesting, and it was like when you're animating characters, you're bound by all these constraints of like making sure you respect body locomotion and body shapes and everything. But when you're animating effects, especially in 2D, it's just pure motion. You're just animating flow, and like you're not bound by any of these physical constraints. You're just like expressing that motion as best as you can, making it feel as best as you can.
I think to add to that slightly, there are pretty much always universal physical concepts. Like there will always be gravity. There's always some form of turbulence, heat rises, all that sort of thing. So even in the stylized world, understanding and maintaining these concepts, or messing with them in certain ways, is really where you get things that look fantastic and really odd sometimes.
Oh, awesome. Well, we before we cut off to the Q&A and we say to our audience here, don't forget to please add questions into the chat. We've collected some, and we're going to be posing those here before too long. But before we do, I want to bring in one more guest. I want to bring in Keith Guert, the studio director. He's an award-winning visual effects artist and CEO of the visual effects studio Beyond Effects and the online community realtimevfx.com. Keith is best known for breaking new ground in immersive graphic technologies for narrative-driven video games. As a leader across the entertainment, VR, and educational industries in VFX, his influence is well recognized in the visually stunning and critically acclaimed Uncharted series and the Last of Us franchise. Over the past decade, Keith has keynoted at leading industry conferences to share and inspire more education for visual effects growth in the interactive entertainment field. Profiled in the 2014 annual Forbes 30 Under 30 list, Keith was inducted into the Full Sail University Hall of Fame in 2015. His team's latest works at Beyond Effects can be seen in products across the real-time industry, including Call of Duty, God of War, What Remains of Edith Finch, Rocket League and Legends of Runeterra. So welcome to Keith. Hello to you, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I'm not going to lie, I was really enjoying just sitting in the background listening. I also got to heckle a little bit in our private chat over here. So
nice. Basically, coming more from giving us a perspective of someone who's there running the studio and keeping the whole the machinery working here for you. A couple of things I think you could add some insight to. For instance, in looking at artists, we've seen from your very talented artists what they do to get the job done and do their amazing work, but you're the one who had to bring them on and hire them in the first place. So from a recruiting standpoint, what are you going to look for in a potential artist? What's going to make someone stand out in the resumes and reels that you get in?
yeah, I mean, I think these guys covered it a tiny bit when they were talking about what to study, what makes a good artist. I think if you're going for an entry-level position, the bar is actually lower than most people assume. What we're looking for isn't somebody that can take on a giant set piece and make an epic dynamic building collapse or train explosion or anything like that. What I really need is somebody who can come in and work with the tools to help us create the wide swath of effects. If you think about a classic shooter, any shooter is going to have probably 300 or 400 different types of bullet hits across the game. That's a lot of work where we're going to make a couple of them as like the senior people, and then we just need help covering the rest of the spread. There's a lot of propagation and a lot of implementation tasks, and all of that really does just come down to us knowing that we can trust this person to use the tools, to communicate when they have questions, because usually like in a game, you can break everything and take down the entire development if you aren't careful. And then the most important and the one that's actually going to run people the longest in their career really is just a good sense of what looks good, what feels good. They called it out. Effects is mostly about feel, and all of that comes from your animation principles.
Oh, very cool. Something I wanted to pose to you as running this Beyond Effects is you are taking on the effects from other for these games. They're outsourcing to your studio. So do you want to speak to this idea of taking this one element of effects and not doing it, at the studio, but doing it here at outsourcing to you?
Yeah. There's been a really slow crawl over the last, I'm going to say 10 years of watching the games industry tear down a lot of the barriers that have prevented game developments from happening in the classic way that most of the other entertainment media has. I mean, Bo, you've got a huge, awesome background from film. And the way film has always worked is you have a couple core creative people working at the film studio and the creative team. and they partner with all the right teams to get that full production done. They bring you in basically as the talent to come in and be awesome, be an expert, and then go on your way after your role has been served. Traditionally, games haven't really been able to do that because tools aren't standardized. Technology is so difficult. Onboarding is traditionally, at some of the studios we worked at, onboarding can take a month, 2 months before we actually start to feel productive output out of an artist. And so there was no potential for a contract labor force with that. What we're seeing now is as our tools are starting to standardize more, Unreal and Unity are becoming quite prolific in our industry. We can hop into an Unreal project and in a matter of a day, 2 days, understand the project and know how to run forward. That's a huge part of it. The other side of it is that the developers themselves are acknowledging that maybe keeping staff of 300 or 400 people all year round through pre-production to post-production is not worth it, especially for some of these departments like us, like effects and audio, that come in late. You know, I've sat on projects where the first year of the production we would have nothing to do, and so we would keep ourselves busy doing R&D and things like that, but we had nothing to do. And then the last year we had way too much to do, and that's what leads to sort of the prolific crunch in our industry and everything else. So the industry is very much shifting into the way of film where you have these core creative teams that want to stay small and agile. And so you've got a team of internally 20 to 40 people, and they want to bring in and partner with the specialists that are really good at what they do and come in, advise early on, and then staff up the production as it's necessary and then go on their way.
Oh, very cool. Just, you know, it's amazing how the technologies are fueling these different kind of business models and letting people, like you were, so you were mentioning before, having artists be able to do what they do best and leveraging the talent of, to best leverage the talent of the artists you have here.
Yeah. Actually, just because we have a really cool opportunity. I mean, Kevin has actually been on the other side of our experience, working while he was at God of War, working with external partners like us for VFX and seeing what that was like. So, I mean, Kevin, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. Like we needed that. We decided to work with Beyond FX while we were at Sony because we needed the help, right? Games are getting bigger and bigger, and it's really hard to justify having at all times and ramping up a team of 10, 15, 20 VFX artists, especially like when Keith mentioned at the beginning of production, it doesn't make sense to have 10, 15 people staffed full time. So knowing that you can lean on experts to come in at the end and help out, ramp up really quickly and efficiently, do the work, and then detach from the project really quickly is a really interesting proposition. It's also really challenging to find good VFX artists. There are not that many people who do this role. So and there's more and more studios opening up, so it's like a really small talent pool to pull from.
Yeah, we're a wildly understaffed industry.
Well, Noman will do what we can to help give you more more talented artists here. So let's shift here and get some questions we had in the chat. We have a good number of questions, and I see if I can kind of find some similar ones and kind of mash those together. Well, how about this? What are some tips you give to someone who's currently in a post-production VFX and wants to transition into real-time VFX? So making the shift into your world.
I can start, I guess. I think that transition, it will be easier and easier as time goes on because like we talked about over the past hour, there's a convergence between the two worlds, I guess, if we can call it that. But I think like the best thing for people who are trying to make that jump from post-production to real time is to just dive into it. Download Unreal, get into Niagara or Cascade, preferably Niagara because that's the way Unreal is moving forward. Start looking at the tutorials, start trying to do effects in there, and just like try to absorb as much information as you can just from watching videos, Twitter, Real-Time VFX, the forum. There's a lot of information out there. Just try to absorb as much as you can through osmosis, and then try to try some stuff, post online, try to get feedback. I think, yeah, just diving into it. There's no easy calculated way of doing it. Just dive into it.
Yeah, for comparison, we actually do get a lot of applicants coming from the film side, and they're like, the background of a talented film VFX artist could be so applicable, but most of the time they've never opened a game engine. And so our very first question, or our very first portfolio review, I mean, Kevin is one of the first people we throw portfolios to, is we just look like, have they ever made a game effect? And if I hop on a call with them, the first question that I'm going to ask is usually, hey, have you ever opened Unreal? If they say no, like, we can't bring them in. But that's kind of how low the bar actually is. If you take the time to just spend a little bit of energy on learning the tools, your film background is going to be fantastic for you. We just need you to cover that initial hurdle of how to use and acknowledge that, like, a game effect is not the same. On a personal level, I've seen a lot of people try to make that jump and really struggle, because we also can't make as good looking stuff as you're used to in film. And so I've seen a lot of people whose egos can't quite keep up with the fact that, like, they were fantastic in Houdini and here they are struggling in a game engine.
I think also there's a lot of thought process that goes into trying to make something look as good as possible without it being expensive, or with it even being able to run in the engine at all. So a lot of the times people in the with a film background or moving from the post-production pipeline will have absolutely fantastic skills when it comes to simulation, or even like rendering their simulation, anything and everything, right? But trying to get that into a game engine, even with a little bit of knowledge of the engine itself, will oftentimes just end in complete disaster, because you can't just export out footage and put it in and it'll work. That's just not how it works. Like, there's a lot of artistry that goes into making sure it works in the engine and making sure it works to the conventions of how games work in general.
Yeah, that's true, because too often you see simulations baked down to a single card, and then you see it like, oh, I imported into Unreal. But in reality, that just breaks down as soon as you move the camera or there's an object near it, because it doesn't have that 3D dimensionality that you would expect from a real-time effect, because the camera can be moved at any time or the player can walk through it.
Yeah, the classic example that I like to throw out here is if you were told to make a fire, most of the time you'll render the fire from the side, and people will just want to play a video of a flame and stick it on a quad. But then our game cameras can usually walk over to the top of that fire and look down on it. And so if you've got a camera facing quad and all of a sudden your flame just turns sideways, and that doesn't work anymore. So we fundamentally can't create the fire in that way.
Yeah, I guess one of the tips we should give is to play games and to try and dissect how game effects are made. Try to step through videos of first-person shooters to see how explosions are built. Try to basically just isolate some effects and try to recreate them using video game techniques to have like some context of how you should be approaching some problems.
And for that matter, every game engine comes with a gigantic library of pre-made effects that are shippable assets. Like Unreal, if you open Unreal, just open some of the effects that are with Unreal or a bunch of the free ones that are on the store and recreate them. Just shamelessly put one on one monitor, or theirs on one monitor and yours on the other, and just recreate it. And you're going to see all of the steps that initial artist went through to make that final effect, and you're going to learn from it.
So when I was trying to learn real-time VFX while I was at Gnomon, Gnomon has one real-time VFX course. I believe at one point you guys might have had a second one, or might have it right now. I'm not 100%, but that's better than pretty much every other school that exists out there right now. No one really teaches this. And when I was really trying to learn, I forced myself to do dailies. So I would sit down and then I would say, in 3 hours, I have to recreate this effect I see. It was usually League of Legends because I considered them to be simple in nature in terms of construction and had a lot of complex movement, and forced me to understand how to utilize Unreal material system better. And honestly, Nathan was an absolute godsend when I was at school, because he was like a year ahead of me and had already made that trek himself, and he passed on so much fantastic knowledge that earlier on helped me immensely. So the people around you can have knowledge, especially people who are in different fields than you would expect, I guess, like environment art or things like that.
Cool.
Yeah, not to be a shill for school, but like the connections you make at school, like they go a long way, because like you can learn a lot from people working with them, and like that motivation, you can feed off of it and like really progress really quickly.
Very cool. You kind of already touched on this with the idea of rendering an effect and putting it on a single quad, but I had another question here from someone basically saying, I can find the question. It was essentially, what are very simple mistakes that beginners can make that make effects look just cheap and bad?
The first two thoughts that come to my mind are building your effect for one camera view, and then, I mean, that flame example again, but I see it all the time in muzzle flashes. We actually, I do a lot of portfolio reviews of students, and the muzzle flash is one that comes up, and they basically make the muzzle flash look good from one side, and then I just tell them like, hey, turn the camera to the other side, and the entire thing just flips. So you have to make sure that you're basically, when you're authoring the effect, you are authoring it with every possible view that the player might have in mind. And then you find ways to sort of compensate for all the different views where it breaks. The other one that comes to mind is something that's super simple, but there's a lot of sort of necessary material tricks that are just standards. There's one called depth fading that I still see games, for whatever reason these days, not use it sometimes. And it's just whenever a card intersects with a piece of geometry, we're trying to sell the illusion that these cards are volumes usually. And so if you have a quad that intersects with another quad, you get a hard line. But there's a simple material trick called depth fading that is pretty much a standard across our industry that just makes that line invisible. So those are the two that came to mind right away for me.
One easy one is just keeping a good color scheme. Because sometimes you can have like wild colors just going everywhere. It's kind of like any kind of color theory. You pick like maybe 3 colors and kind of like stick with that, or just try to be more harmonious or more contrasted.
And not using fully saturated reds.
Yep.
Is another one.
One thing I look for the most when looking at student work or people who are trying to learn real-time VFX in general is I'm trying to break down the concepts that they understood and they applied in the thing that they made. Because even if, let's say they make a fire that's standing straight up, right? If they, for some reason, are able to put a camera fade while you move over and then some sort of thing to cover the transition or something like that, then I know they understand the concept of, well, I can't just put the fire here, but I'm trying to utilize what I can do to the best of my ability, right? So extrapolating the ideas of what makes a good real-time VFX, is realistically what I'm looking for the most. It doesn't necessarily mean that they need to know everything or have like an extreme breadth of knowledge, but I can see what it is that they're trying to do or the concepts that they truly understood while making it.
Yeah, for me, something I would steer people who get into it is steer away from is like just diving too deeply into technical stuff too early. Like it's cool to dive into like the flashy, interesting, or like flashy technical effects, like getting fluids moving when you're walking through them, or like snow deformation, or like really complex explosions and stuff like that, or like trying to get really deep into simulation. But at the end of the day, I think what makes a good effects is, like we spoke about already, is like animation and feel. And then like Nathan mentioned, color. Like if you have those basics down, you will be able to make appealing effects. Whereas diving deep into the tech will get you like maybe interesting behaviors, but it doesn't necessarily mean you know how to compose a compelling effect.
All right, cool.
Just to add on to that with really quick call out, we see a lot of effects in our art tests and in portfolio reviews. We see a lot of effects that all of the animation curves are still linear. and so they feel boring. And it's like the very first thing that we should do in our block out of an effect is just look at the timing and look at the feel of it. And most of that comes from curves and those, again, the 12 principles of animation. Getting your anticipation and your build up and the follow through down is really what makes a good effect, regardless of the amount of detail that gets put into it. And no matter how awesome your pipeline and your pre-engine tools are, if you can't use good timing on it, it's still going to be a crap effect.
All right. As someone who teaches a math class at Gnomon, I have to ask this question from someone here up the chat. Does VFX require good knowledge of math? You've had good answers so far. Don't let me down on this one.
Like I'm muted at the same time. Okay.
So
personally,
the knowledge of math you bring to your craft.
I personally believe a little bit goes a long way with VFX, and it also really depends on in what direction of real-time effects you're looking to get into. So for stylized work, a lot of the times the math isn't really that relevant. For things closer orientated towards tech art and realism, sometimes you do need to dive a little bit deeper, especially in shaders or material graphs. An understanding of how HLSL works and an understanding of just in general how shader nodes work a lot of the time, just math nodes in general, goes a really, really, really long way in terms of making things that look fantastic.
Yeah, I would say mostly it's shaders which you mostly need the math knowledge, and I would just say just like learn how to use the dot product. That's a huge one.
Yes.
Yeah, the dot product might be number one here. It'll probably come up to be like a interview question also, so it's always good to know.
True.
I think math is not necessary because you can, without knowing math and just doing like basic shader stuff, you can get like really good looking stuff. But knowledge of math will allow you to truly bend the shaders to do what you really want them to do and really have control over your effect.
Yep. Most of the time in shaders, the basics ones are: do you know how to multiply? Do you know how to add? Do you know how to subtract? Yeah.
Yeah, our use of math is a little bit unique, but if you just have a good solid understanding of the principles, it can, like Kevin said, it can take you really far, but it's not one of the core necessities to making good art, especially now that our tools are becoming more and more standardized.
Cool, good. So that's validating. Thank you all. So this is a question here on approach to art direction for this kind of stuff. Art directing the team. So want to know the process. Do you provide concepts? How do you give feedback? How do you handle the art direction side of this?
Who wants to go first?
Is the question for VFX or like just VFX as a whole?
Well, this was posed out to you, so what's the general approach to art direction with your team? Providing concepts, critiques, feedback, reference, etc.
I'll start. I mean, I think one of the core benefits of working in real time is that we can iterate quickly. And so what we find is that the more iterations we do and share with everybody, the more insight and direction we get. Our tasks start with something all the way on, like on one side, we worked with some of the most beautiful concept and storyboards I've ever seen. And on others, we've worked with like Excel sheet line items that say bubbles and everything in between. And so we find ways to iterate quickly. Sometimes that can be us just calling the designer and brainstorming with them of what they need, or the environment artist, art director, whoever is giving us the task. Sometimes we sketch it out or build out an animatic in Previs. Or other times we can just like mock it up really fast in the engine and go and just start iterating and spinning. From there, it becomes just as frequent check-ins as possible as we kind of hone it in.
Yeah, I've mentioned it before, like it's good to block everything first, just so the art director can see just easily like kind of the basic kind of animation, the color, and then from there on you can like start polishing it up based on the art director's vision.
That's a really important call out. Our stuff is, I mean, it's interactive and it has to be implemented in very specific ways. And so one of the first things that we always tell, especially like when we bring in a junior, is when you get a task, the first thing you should do is hook up something, anything, so you can see all of the things that it needs to be. And that becomes our block-in. And then we try to focus on timing from there and make it feel good. Like I can make an explosion out of just a sphere growing if I make that feel good. And then the rest of it is just going to be in the detail.
I think we have a broad focus on context usually, like how something is being utilized, because you can make something look great on like a gray background or a black background. And it's like, oh, wow, it looks fantastic. And then you drop it into like a bright sunny field or something like that, and it looks terrible. So understanding how it'll be utilized in different scenarios and trying to really utilize it as fast and as soon as possible is a very strong approach.
Yeah. Cool. Any other comments on that? I was gonna give you guys one last question here. Unless you had anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in as well that there's, it's worth calling out that our effects don't always serve the purpose of just looking good. They are often feedback first or information first. And then look good second. So we get a lot of design effects is what I always call them, where like I can make the coolest effect in the world, and if it doesn't communicate clearly to the player, the designer's going to look at it and say, wow, that's crap. I hate that. Why don't we just get a green circle? And so we have to also make sure not only that we're iterating with our art director, but that we're iterating with whoever's in charge of the reason for that effect to exist.
Oh, sounds good. Time for one last question here. We'll end on an inspirational note, asking if there's a particular favorite shot that you've done, something that really kind of was fulfilling and inspiring for you. Anything in particular in your work come up as particularly fulfilling and inspiring?
I'll start real quick since my colleagues here tight-lipped. The teleport top of Yggdrasil tree in God of War. Yeah, that was pretty cool. Corey just kind of walks around the studio a lot and talks to people. And he walked into our section there and he was just like, make something cool. And I was like, okay. So my experience was just kind of like blank check. And that was really fun and a cool experience because it, got approved and got pushed and then eventually made it in the game. So
yeah, that was a cool section of the game.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. For me, it was the realm travel room in God of War. That whole intro sequence when the tree lights up for the first time, or like comes to life for the first time, and that whole teleport sequence. Like I had a lot of fun doing that, and I think it's one of the more complex sequences I've done. Yeah.
Yep. For me, it would be Nocturne on Runeterra. It was like one of the first almost like cinematic experience. And what made it cool is like this kind of stuff is capable on mobile. It wasn't just sit on PC. And yeah, it was just cool to see how players can react to it.
My more memorable times always come down to like cool puzzles that we solved in unique ways. The one that comes to mind first for me is actually, it was a very abstract problem space, not even on games, but I worked with a team in the UK that was trying to use VR for the human genome, trying to sort of answer the question of, is it possible to map out the genome in 3D space in VR and allow the viewer basically to spot problems, because we are by nature 3D perceptive beings. And so we just kept trying to like look over the data and relay it out around us in 3D space and walk through it in VR. And it didn't go anywhere. We didn't win the grant, but it was such a cool problem space to sort of ponder over.
That's very cool. All right. I want to thank you all, Kevin, Thomas, Nathan, Keith. This was really, thank you for sharing your work, your insight, all this. It's very appreciative. So on behalf of Gnomon and all of our streaming viewers, I want to thank you guys so much. And we're going to call it a night. So thank you all from the Noman campus. We're going to wrap it up. Thanks so much. Good night.
All right. Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.
guys.
Bye bye.
Oh, thank you.